You can feel the iron shackles cutting into your wrists. The weight drags your arms downward as they force you through the villa's stone corridor, past the other slaves who won't meet your eyes. Your bare feet scrape against mosaic tiles that cost more than your life. 3 days ago, you ran 3 days where you walked through olive groves as a free woman, where no one owned the breath in your lungs. Now, as they push you into the branding chamber, you smell burning coals and something worse underneath old fear baked into the walls. The stigmator doesn't look at your face. He never does. To him, your inventory being corrected. Before we go deeper into what happened next, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. It's absolutely incredible to me that a story this dark from 2,000 years ago somehow matters to people across every continent today. This is Rome 127 AD, during the reign of Hadrian. By this point in imperial history, the machinery of slavery had become so refined, so bureaucratized, that punishment wasn't personal anymore, it was administrative. The Roman legal code, particularly the Corpus Juris Civilis, later compiled under Justinian, preserved in brutal clarity exactly what happened to women who attempted escape. Not metaphors, not euphemisms. Actual procedures documented by actual officials who saw this work as no different than tax collection or road maintenance. The historians Tacitus, Suetonius, and Seneca recorded these practices in their writings, not with outrage, but with the casual tone of men describing whether that's what makes it so chilling, not that it happened, but that it was considered ordinary. An escaped female slave wasn't a tragedy to Romans. She was a problem requiring a solution, and Rome had perfected its solutions. The woman dragged into that chamber, let's call her by the name scratched into a recovered slave collar found near Pompeii, Fortunata, ironic, considering what the name means, lucky, she was born into slavery, the daughter of a woman who was also born into it, creating a genealogy of bondage that Roman law explicitly protected. Under the legal principle of partus sequitur, ventrum, any child born to an enslaved mother was automatically property, regardless of who the father was. Fortunata had spent 26 years serving a patrician family in a villa just outside Rome's city walls. She worked in the kitchens, she scrubbed floors. And one night, during a festival, when the household was distracted and drunk, she walked out the servants' entrance and kept walking. For 72 hours, she was no one's property. She slept under stars that belonged to no master. She drank from streams without permission. And then, on the 3rd day, a rural slave patrol spotted her on the Via Appia. The slave hunters fugitiveri were professional trackers paid by commission. They used dogs. They carried nets. When they found her, they didn't beat her. Not yet. That would come later, and it would be official. They simply bound her wrists and feet, loaded her onto a cart, like damaged goods being returned to a merchant, and delivered her back to the villa. Her owner paid the fugitiveri their fee, about 20 denarii, roughly a week's wages for a legionary soldier. Fortunata's recapture was a business transaction, receipted and recorded in a ledger that no longer survives, but absolutely existed. What happened next was called stigmatization, the branding. But before you imagine some crude, angry master with a red-hot poker, understand this: Rome had professional slave markers. The stigmator was a licensed imperial official who traveled between states, performing this procedure with bureaucratic efficiency. He arrived with his tuza, portable brazier, several iron stamps with different letters, leather straps for restraint, and a wooden block to press the victim's head against for stability. The irons were heated until they glowed orange-white. hot enough that the metal would cauterize instantly rather than merely burn. This prevented infection, not out of mercy, but because a dead slave was worthless and a scarred slave could still work. They held Fortunata's head against the block. She screamed. The stigmator pressed the iron into her forehead knot. Quickly, but with slow, deliberate pressure, holding it there for a count that felt endless. The smell was unforgettable. Burning hair, searing flesh, the primal wrongness of a human body being branded like livestock. When he finally pulled the iron away, 3 letters remained burned into her skin, raised and permanent. FVG, Fugitiva, Runaway. Some brands were more elaborate. Archaeologists have recovered slave collars with inscriptions reading, "Tin mi quia fugio," hold me because I flee, followed by the owner's name and address, transforming the enslaved person into a walking lost and found notice. The Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum, a comprehensive catalog of Roman inscriptions, contains dozens of these recovered collars. They're not metaphors, they're artifacts you can see in museums today. Physical proof that human beings wore metal around their necks engraved with their own dehumanization. But branding was only the first punishment. Roman law offered owners a menu of options, each calibrated for maximum psychological destruction while preserving the slave's utility as labor. The second punishment Fortunata would endure was public shackling at the Ianua, the main entrance of the household. This wasn't random placement. Roman architecture was deeply symbolic. The Ianua marked the threshold between private familia and public street, between inside and outside, between citizen and foreigner. To change someone there was to transform them into a living architectural feature, a human door ornament designed to communicate a message to everyone who passed. This is what happens when you run. They fastened iron manacles around her wrists and ankles, then chained her to one of the stone columns flanking the entrance. The manacles were deliberately sized too small tight enough to cut circulation, ensuring constant pain. She would stand there, sometimes for days, denied food, water, and any shelter from the elements. Rome in summer reached temperatures that cracked stone. In winter, rain turned to sleet. Fortunata stood through both. Her skin blistered and peeled from sun exposure. At night, she shivered so violently that the chains rattled against the column, a sound that kept other slaves awake, which was part of the design. The punishment was as much about them as it was about her. Passers-by were encouraged to participate. Merchants spat at her feet. Children threw rotten fruit. Other slaves, when ordered by their masters, were forced to verbally abuse her acquired, to call her shameful, stupid, worthless while she stood silent and exposed. Refusal meant joining her. So they complied, and something inside them broke a little more. The psychological architecture of slavery depended on making the enslaved complicit in each other's degradation, ensuring that solidarity became almost impossible. You couldn't trust the person beside you because yesterday they were forced to humiliate you, and tomorrow you might be forced to do the same to them. The chains weren't just metal, they were a system. But here's where Roman punishment crossed from brutal into theatrical. For women who attempted repeated escapes or whose flight was deemed particularly brazen, Roman law permitted a third option, damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. This was a legal sentence, not mob violence. It required documentation, a magistrate's seal, official approval. And once approved, the woman would be delivered to the arena not as a gladiator with training and armor, but as a victim, unarmed and defenseless. To be killed by wild animals in front of tens of thousands of cheering spectators, the games weren't just entertainment, They were state-sponsored psychological warfare designed to reinforce social hierarchies through public execution. The Colosseum could hold 50,000 people. Smaller provincial amphitheaters held anywhere from 5 to 20,000. These crowds didn't gather to watch fair fights. They came to see the social order violently reasserted too. Watch criminals, rebels, and runaway slaves torn apart as proof that defiance always ended the same way. Women condemned to the arena were sometimes dressed in costumes, forced to play characters from mythology before being killed. Others were simply released into the sand, naked and terrified, while a starved bear or lion was released from the opposite gate. The animals used in these executions were deliberately brutalized beforehand. Roman bestiary animal handlers kept feeding schedules specifically designed to maximize aggression. A lion fed regularly was sluggish, almost docile. A lion starved for 3 days became a weaponized predator. The goal wasn't just death, it was spectacle, prolonged suffering, visible terror. The crowd wanted to see her run. They wanted to hear her scream. They bet on how long she would last 5 minutes, 10, whether she'd collapse before the first bite or after. The poet Martial wrote entire epigrams about arena deaths, describing them with the casual tone of a sports commentator. She fell gracefully, he wrote of one execution, as if dying well was a performance skill. After each death, arena slaves called libertinari used iron hooks to drag the body across the sand, leaving long red trails. Body parts were collected in wicker baskets. The sand was raked, but never cleaned. Blood soaked through, layer upon layer, until the arena floor became a kind of compressed archaeological record of violence-dried blood mixed with fresh animal and human, criminal and slave, all ground together into the foundation of Roman entertainment. By the end of a full day of games, the smell was overwhelming, iron and decay. Thousands of spectators went home with that scent in their clothes, and they came back the next month for more. For those who survived the Arenor whose owners decided death was too expensive a loss, there was a fourth punishment. More common and more intimate, systematic flogging with the flagrum. This wasn't a simple whip. The Roman flagrum was a multi-thonged instrument, each leather strand embedded with small fragments of metal, bone, or glass. When it struck flesh, these fragments caught and tore, ripping skin away in strips. A single lash could open wounds several inches long. Repeated strikes didn't just bruise, they flayed. Pliny the Elder, Seneca, and multiple other sources reference flogging as routine discipline, mentioned with the same casual frequency as feeding schedules or wage payments. The procedure was unregulated. No law specified a maximum number of lashes. No external authority needed to be consulted. A master could order 10 lashes or 300, and both were perfectly legal. In practice, this meant that severity depended entirely on the owner's mood, the perceived severity of the offense, and whether they cared if the slave survived. Some whippings were explicitly designed to kill slowly nod through immediate trauma, but through infection, blood loss, and organ failure over days or weeks. The wounds were left untreated deliberately. The woman would be forced to return to work immediately, carrying water or grinding grain with her back shredded and bleeding. She couldn't lean against walls. She couldn't lie down. Sleep became impossible. The wounds attracted flies. Infection set in. The smell of rotting flesh served as yet another warning to everyone nearby. For women who escaped multiple times, there were additional layers of cruelty built specifically around gender. Public humiliation took forms designed to destroy dignity in ways uniquely devastating to female slaves. After severe whippings, women might be displayed partially or fully exposed in common areas where other slaves worked, their torn bodies serving as living warnings. Roman authors like Plautus and Terence referenced these practices casually in their comedies. Treating the suffering of slave women as background material for jokes, the audience laughed because it was familiar, because it was normal, because somewhere in Rome, at that very moment, it was happening. And for the most severe cases for women who escaped multiple times or who were deemed too rebellious to be salvaged, there was a final punishment. One that didn't end in dramatic spectacle, but in slow, invisible annihilation, deportatio in metallum. Deportation to the mines. This was a legal sentence codified in Roman law and considered among the most extreme non-death penalties available. It was, in effect, a death sentence disguised as labor reassignment. The woman would be transferred to imperial mines in provinces like Recapture or Sardinia, places where survival rates were measured in months, not years. Roman mines were subterranean nightmares, tunnels barely wide enough to crawl through, air thick with dust and toxic particles, mercury, lead, arsenic that destroyed lungs, teeth, and minds. Ventilation was nearly non-existent. Collapse was constant. Workers extracted, or with primitive tools, by candlelight or in complete darkness, their hands bleeding, their bodies breaking until they physically could not continue. And then they died. Not quickly, not mercifully. They died choking on their own fluids as their lungs filled with mineral dust. They died from mercury poisoning that made their teeth fall out, their gums rot. Their hands shake uncontrollably until they couldn't hold a pickaxe and were left chained in deeper shafts to starve. They died in tunnel collapses, buried alive in darkness. Their screams audible through the rock for hours until they finally suffocated. Bodies weren't removed when a worker died, and they died constantly. The corpse was dragged to a side shaft and left to decompose. The smell in the deeper tunnels was unimaginable. Human waste, rotting flesh, stagnant water, and toxic gases combining into an atmosphere that was itself lethal. Some miners went blind from working in perpetual darkness. Others developed respiratory diseases that drowned them slowly while they were still forced to swing their tools. The sentence was lifelong. Very, very few survived long enough for release. And unlike visible punishments like branding or arena executions, deportation to the mines was punishment through erasure. The woman sent underground was meant to disappear. Her suffering occurred in absolute darkness, witnessed by no one except the other condemned. And it was no less real for being invisible. What's perhaps most disturbing isn't that these punishments existed, but how they were documented. Roman historians recorded them with clinical detachment. Suetonius mentioned slave brandings in his imperial biographies, the same way he described banquet menus' interesting details. Nothing more. Tacitus noted arena executions and mine deportations in his annals without moral commentary, treating them as historical facts equivalent to tax reforms or military campaigns. Even Seneca, who came closest to expressing philosophical discomfort, wrote in his letters, Servi sunt, immo homines. They are slaves. No, they are human beings. But Seneca never called for abolition. He never demanded legal reform. He expressed discomfort and continued living comfortably in a society built on their suffering. His own household, staffed by people he owned. The poet Horace wrote jokes about beating slaves. Juvenal satirized cruel mistresses who tortured their slave women for minor infractions like improper hairstyling. But his satire targeted the mistress's pettiness, not the system that gave them absolute power. These weren't fringe voices. These were Rome's celebrated intellectuals, the men whose words we still study, whose philosophy we still quote. And every single one of them documented horror with the casual tone of people describing rain. That's the real horror. Not that Romans were uniquely evil, but that they were uniquely efficient at bureaucratizing cruelty, at building infrastructure around suffering until it became invisible. They created legal codes for branding, official positions for slave tracking, architectural conventions for public shaming, state-funded arenas for mass execution, imperial mines for erasure. And they documented all of it with the dry precision of accountants, because to them, this wasn't moral failure, it was administrative necessity. When an entire civilization processes human suffering like grain shipments, when citizens watch horror without objecting, evil doesn't announce itself with monsters and darkness. It arrives in daylight, wearing the robes of law, justified by tradition, filed in triplicate. Fortunata's story and the stories of countless women whose names were never recorded didn't end with dramatic rebellion or miraculous escape. Most of these stories ended in silence, a branded woman working until her body gave out, a skeleton in a mine shaft, unnamed and unmourned, a notation in a ledger, property lost, cause expired. What survives are fragments. Slave collars in museums with their terrible inscriptions still legible after 2,000 years. Legal texts describing procedures in language so cold it freezes your breath. Historians' casual mentions of routine brutality written without the slightest pause of conscience. The Colosseum still stands. Tourists take photos in front of arches that once echoed with screams. Guides describe gladiatorial combat and naval battles, the spectacle and the glory. But they rarely mention the women condemned to the sand, unarmed and terrified, or the fact that beneath those stones lies compressed evidence of thousands of executions that were considered entertainment, justice, and social necessity all at once. The Roman legal code influenced virtually every Western legal system that followed. We inherited their concepts of property, contract, and citizenship. We also inherited their capacity to make cruelty systematic, to transform violence into procedure, to convince ourselves that some people aren't really people, they're things, problems, inventory requiring correction. Fortunata's story lingers because it was never just hers. It was the quiet machinery of power laid bare. In the echo of her suffering, we inherit a warning that cruelty thrives, not in monstrous acts alone, but in the ordinary willingness to look away. The stones remember because someone must, because forgetting is how the pattern repeats. So we listen finally to the voices pressed beneath empire's weight, to the truths carved into flesh when ink was too kind. And in that listening, perhaps, we find the first small fracture in the long, unbroken line of obedience.